So really, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. A special thank you to the panel, which is really a pretty extraordinary group to really talk to us today about the future of the Global Plastics Treaty. So really incredibly excited to have this opportunity for you all to join us. My name is Tony McDonald. I'm the director of the Urban Coast Institute at Monmouth University in West Long Branch, New Jersey, and I'm also a member of the board of the Global Ocean Forum. So. Miriam will give you a little bit of background, a little bit on the Global Ocean Forum and our webinar series before we move into the formal program. So with that, I really want to welcome everybody today and turn it over to Miriam.
Hello, everyone. Let me add my welcome and gratitude to you all, the speakers and attendees of this webinar, for your interest and participation in today's meeting. The Global Ocean Forum UCI Monmouth webinars were envisioned to mobilize civil society centered on critical ocean and climate action as identified in the Assessing Progress on Ocean and Climate Action Reports, called the ROCA reports for short. This webinar series also provides a platform for advocating relevant UN Ocean Decade programs and activities aimed at safeguarding our ocean and combating climate change for a sustainable future. The common thread that runs through each of the webinars in this series is the need for fostering collaboration and collective engagement among all stakeholders following an integrated approach towards conservation and sustainable use of the ocean. The first webinar highlighted the significance of the BBNJ Agreement to ocean and climate action, encouraged the incorporation of ocean climate actions in nationally determined contributions to reduce national emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change, and foster collaboration on the road to the UN Ocean Conference in Nice in 2025. This second webinar on the development of a global plastics treaty will trace how the integrated approach is reflected in various aspects of the negotiations and future implementation of the treaty, including how it addresses the plastics problem across the stages of the cycle of plastic and the consideration of environmental, economic, health, equity, and justice issues. I will elaborate on how the third webinar on sustainable blue economy reflects this thread at the end of this meeting. This webinar will try to explore the implications of a global plastics treaty for the management of land-based marine pollution. At the first session of the fifth session of the INC, delegates debated whether a standalone provision on principles and approaches would be needed. Those in support called for the inclusion of references to, among others, the precautionary principle, common but differentiated responsibilities, the polluter pays principle, best available science, and recognition of the special circumstances of small island developing states. It is perhaps useful to recall that integrated coastal management was the management approach endorsed by the UN Global Program of Action for the Protection of the Marine Environment from Land-Based Activities. During its time, the only global intergovernmental mechanism that directly addressed the connectivity between terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, and marine ecosystems. It is to be hoped that delegations would realize the value of having such a provision and that the plastics treaty process would open up to a more integrated approach among other collaborative approaches to the plastics issue that would provide guidance on how the treaty will be interpreted, implemented, and operationalized. We hope that our panelists will touch on this as they respond to key questions at today's webinar. Thanks. Thank you. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you very much, Miriam. And as she indicated, actually, the last year and a half have been really remarkable years internationally in sort of attention to ocean issues, as she suggested. I mean, there's really a lot of interest and a lot of recognition of the significance of oceans across a variety of different international instruments. The challenges, however, seem to be greater than ever. The challenges of governance, the challenges of financing, the challenge of mobilizing action continue to be a challenge. So really, I think one of the focuses today, specifically on this issue, I think plastics is a unique opportunity opportunity to really focus on a particular problem in a way that we hopefully can achieve consensus and really meaningful action. So incredibly excited today. Just a word of logistics before I introduce our panelists today. Is just anybody interested in posing a question, please, the chat function is open. Please, I encourage you to put them in the chat. Katie Mitchell will help us track those, and you have the option of raising your hand. There's quite a few people on the call, so it's sometimes hard to track that. We will do our best to respond to as many questions as we can during the discussion. So we encourage everybody to be involved in our discussion today. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers. I'm going to introduce them all now and then sort of moderate sort of the transition into the different parts of our programs. But everybody who registered this, we have the detailed bios available, and you can consult those if you want more detail. But really want to really recognize that we really have a full range of participants from civil society, from the UN Secretariat, from groups who are really working at the regional scale to really emphasize both the importance of addressing these issues and the way we might move forward. So our speakers today are Jyotika Mather-Philip. Thank you very much, Jyotika. She is the Executive Secretary of the Plastic Pollution and head of the Secretariat. Prior to this assignment, she served as the director of the Secretariat on the Convention on Biodiversity. So you can see there's many different ways into this issue. So we really appreciate her joining us today. In addition, we have Margaret Spring. I've long known Margaret Spring from her days on the Senate Commerce Committee, but she has gone to great heights since then. She is currently the Chief Conservation and Science Officer at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. But really, describing all of her accomplishments over the years would take a long time. I will point out specifically that I saw her passion for this issue up close and personal when she was the chief, that she chaired the expert committee, the National Academy of Sciences, on reckoning with the U.S. role in ocean plastics waste. So she really did a remarkable job leading that group, and since then she's taken it forward to be an active participant in the treaty negotiations. So thank you, Margaret, for joining us. Going over to also staying on the West Coast, but further north in Vancouver, we have Mario Vierjos. Mario is the Director of Coastal Policy and Humanities Research, which undertakes interdisciplinary research on ocean issues. She is also a senior associate with the Global Ocean Forum and a research associate at the University of British Columbia. So thank you, Mario, and we'll look forward to your perspectives. Again, we are still waiting, I think, for our last panelist to join us, but hopefully she will be able to join us, and that will be
join the call.
Danielle has joined us. Oh, great. Thank you very much, Danielle. Sorry you don't pop up on my screen, so I didn't see you, but very much appreciate you joining us. Daniela is the senior legal campaigner focused on the upstream parts of the Plastics Treaty for CIEL's Environmental Health Program. She is a Colombian campaigner with relevant experience influencing national and international policy. She worked as a public policy specialist for the Nature Conservancy and advocacy manager for the Mar Viva Foundation. So thank you very much, Daniela, for joining us today. So we're going to start off our session today by asking Jyotika to give us a bit of an overview of the current stage of the process and the next steps. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jyotika. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. And also, let me, start by saying that today's events and events such as this and your continued engagement in the INC process are essential to ensuring an inclusive process where all voices are heard. So thank you for organizing this and allowing me to participate. Good afternoon, good evening, and good day to all the participants here. Today, I will provide a brief update on the negotiations and where we are at the process. Let me start by saying, as you know, the pace of this negotiation process has been unprecedented. Since the INC began its work in 2022, 5 negotiation sessions have taken place, from INC 1 in Uruguay, followed by the sessions in France and Kenya in 2023, then Canada in April 2024, and most recently, the first part of the INC 5 in the Republic of Korea in December 2024. At INC 5.1, and I hope a lot of you were there, although we don't get a chance to meet one-to-one, but hopefully we will after the treaty is done. At INC 5.1, the committee did not finalize the negotiations. However, in my view, significant progress was achieved by member states. The committee adjourned the session, agreeing that the chair's text, which was released on 1st of December, will be the starting point for negotiations when it reconvenes later this year. The 22-page chair's text offers a clear structure and 32 articles to shape the future treaty. And when negotiators meet again at INC 5.2, their focus will be on finalizing and agreeing on the text. While multilateral negotiations are complex, there is substantial agreement on key issues, including product design. This treaty could also be the first international legally binding agreement to formally recognize and incorporate circularity as a core element in addressing plastic pollution. The current areas of consensus provide a strong foundation for progress. However, as you know, many challenges remain, particularly around provisions regulating chemicals of concern in plastic products, addressing sustainable consumption and production, and on the establishment of a financial mechanism, including catalyzing and alignment of financial flows. Bridging these gaps will be essential for members of the committee to reach a meaningful agreement in the upcoming session. As of now, the timing and location of the second part of the fifth session are still being decided, and I hope in the coming weeks I will be able to send a notification informing you of the dates and venue. As the INC Executive Secretary, I want to emphasize that the goal remains securing an agreement this year. While this is a member-driven process, the contributions of observers like you through knowledge sharing, insight, science, and advocacy remain invaluable in enriching and moving discussions forward. On the road to INC 5.2, discussions like this one are essential to maintaining momentum on the INC process. High-level events, such as the upcoming UN Oceans Conference, also provide a critical platform to keep the political focus on the process and to reinforce the urgency of securing a global agreement on plastic pollution. And for those who will be there, I hope to meet you in Nice. The world is counting on all of us to seize this moment, to craft a treaty that will stand the test of time, protecting this planet and our future. Let's make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and really a great credit to you and the group for the ambition moving this forward. Thinking about what we haven't gotten over the finish line yet, but really the progress is pretty remarkable. I've never seen anything move so quickly internationally. I also would take the moderator's prerogative about underscoring, I think, the importance of civil society. And this is, I think, a unique treaty, particularly that the role and the demand of civil society for action in this will be, I think, critical to really what I would call stealing the governments to take some of the hard decisions that still remain to be made. So really, thank you for making the time today and for your encouragement and all that you do. So with that, we're going to kind of move into the discussion. And so we're really going to try to move this around, but we really want to make sure that everybody gets a chance on the panel first to sort of share some of their ideas and their responses to some questions. Reminder to folks, if they have questions, to put them in the chat. It's probably easier to put them in as you hear the discussion. So with that, I'm going to open up the discussion a little bit and direct this first just for responses a little bit to Mario and Daniela. How does the draft treaty currently address the plastics problem across the stages of the life cycle of plastic, and how can it be strengthened? And again, others can comment, but why don't I start off with you, Mario, with your thoughts, and then we'll turn to you, Daniela.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you also to Jyoti. It's really nice to have the executive secretary of this process share her insights to and be willing to listen also to all of these viewpoints. So thank you again for that. And yeah, from I haven't been to all of the INCs, but from my experience in a couple of them, it was a very deadlocked process. And that's not unusual for international negotiations. But when we try to sort of achieve this goal that the UNEA resolution originally in 2022 put forward, that the treaty would have both binding and voluntary approaches and be based on a comprehensive approach that addresses the full life cycle of plastic. It's that's been really difficult to achieve, and that has to do with the country's economic interest, and particularly the economic interest of those countries that are petroleum-producing states. So having that language on limits to the production on or any kind of binding language on limits of production of virgin plastics or new plastics has been extremely difficult. And there's now emerged a couple of negotiating blocks in that process. There's the like-minded group. Sometimes I've also heard parts of this being referred to as the Gulf Cooperation Council. But essentially, it's being led by petroleum-producing states like Saudi Arabia and Russian Federation and so on. But essentially, countries whose economic development depends on producing that petroleum. And they would very much love to see this treaty focus on what's called downstream measures or response measures, which is mainly things like plastic waste management, recycling, and so on, things that we're already doing, but in many countries, but perhaps in a more coordinated way. And then the other group counter to that is the High Ambition Coalition, which really wants to have a strong treaty on all aspects, the whole full life cycle of plastics, as the UNEA resolution calls for. And so there's really these two competing visions of what this treaty should be. And those are really difficult to bridge, particularly when the timeline for the treaty is quite short. And we at the original timeline really was 2 years. Now it's going to be more like 3 years, but still that's incredibly fast to do an international treaty. The BB&J process took almost 20 years, first in informals and then in increasingly formal processes. So one of the big discussion points have been around actually the procedural parts and the rules of procedure, and whether countries can take or should take decisions by consensus, which the like-minded group or the group led by the petroleum-producing states would like, because then a treaty cannot take place without their agreement into all of the provisions, and that would result probably in a much weaker treaty in the eyes of the like-minded group who want or the High Ambition Coalition who want the strong treaty. And the current rules of procedure that are still in, as I understand, in draft format, have not been fully agreed to, would allow for some voting. And this is, of course, what the High Ambition Coalition would like, because through voting, you could get a much stronger treaty, but then you would leave some countries behind as well, who would perhaps not participate in such a treaty. So that has been one of the issues that continues to be one of the issues. It's not unusual for international negotiations to be deadlocked around difficult issues. That happens every time. But moving forward may require reverting back to that original UNEA resolution that talks about binding measures and voluntary measures, and perhaps where we're going to end up is some measures that are more contentious being more voluntary at this point. But there are other options as well. So we'll see how that moves forward. I think that's all I can say. I think somebody else perhaps can elaborate. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we'll move forward. Thank you, Mario. Danielle, I wonder if you'd share some of your perspectives on what the challenges are, but anything you can say, particularly why it's so important in the region that you live in, and what your thoughts are about how what those challenges are and how we might address them in the treaty.
Thank you, Marjo, and thank you, Tony, and thank you very much for the invitation to this space. I work for CL, which is the Center for International Environmental Law, and we've been a part of this process since before we had the UNIA resolution on the table. So we have an interesting overview of how the dynamics have changed and how the process has evolved. And in maybe ahead we can have a bit more detailed exchange of ideas on the basis of what you just said, Mario, on what are the challenges and the barriers that we are seeing right now for having an effective plastics treaty that fulfills the mandate of UNIA Resolution 514, which is to end plastic pollution with a full life cycle approach. And that part of the full life cycle approach was already agreed by 193 countries in the UNIA resolution. And I agree with what you just said, and we need to go back to that mandate that is telling us to end plastic pollution with a full life cycle approach that is a universal agreement for that. And maybe I want to highlight 3 elements on how the treaty can address the problem across the full life cycle of plastics, as the UNIA mandate resolution is telling. And first, and this might seem obvious, but first we need the treaty to cover the full life cycle of plastics, including the production of primary plastic polymers. We cannot let the treaty to arbitrarily omit regulation on some of the sections of the full life cycle of plastics, because what best science available is telling us is that we need measures across the full life cycle of plastics, including on the production of plastics. Otherwise, for example, we won't be able to fulfill climate goals. We know today that if plastic production is left unchecked, it will consume up to 31% of our remaining carbon budget to achieve the 1.5 goal of the Paris Agreement. And so you can get a magnitude of what this means. That's more than what's expected, or the shares that are expected for the energy and transportation sectors. So we cannot omit regulation on some of these parts of the full life cycle, and the treaty won't fulfill its mandate to end plastic pollution if we remove obligations from these or other stages of the life cycle of plastics. But one thing that's interesting here is that at this stage where we are today, we cannot say that the treaty will fulfill the mandate to cover the full life cycle of plastics. What we have right now on the table is a broad set of options, and depending on the final choices that countries will have or will choose, we will either get a probably weak but workable treaty to end plastic pollution, or a document that holds little value to solve this problem. On the one hand, we have on the table today options that cover the full life cycle of plastics, including the urgent need to limit and reduce the production of primary plastic polymers, and that provides some mechanism to probably address these at the conference of the parties via decisions of the conference of the parties. But let's be transparent, these mechanisms are still weaker than what science is recommending us. And some countries are still arguing today that those weak mechanisms are unrealistically ambitious, but they can set a basis for working in the future. And on the other hand, what we have right now, if countries decide to back options that, for example, eliminate regulation across entire sections of the full life cycle, or go to voluntary approaches that we know have not been effective in other multilateral environmental agreements, the treaty could be worthless, could not worth the paper it's written on. And this would demonstrate a denial of what the plastic pollution crisis actually is, while at the same time pretending to provide solutions which would in fact only deepen a problem. And how can that full life cycle be strengthened? Let me enumerate 2 elements, although there are others on the table that we can discuss as the conversation evolves and progresses. The first one, countries must remain strong in their support for what is today Article 6, which is the article that it's dedicated to deal with the production of plastics. In Busan at INC5, we saw more than 100 countries endorsing text for a dedicated article to limit and eventually reduce plastic production. And now it's the time to maintain and support that momentum to fulfill the mandate given by Resolution 514. And the second element that I want to highlight here is we need countries to strengthen the measures to ban toxic chemicals. We know today that there are more than 4,000 chemicals of concern for human health in plastics, and we know that only 2% of those chemicals are regulated in international governance. And the text, as it stands today, only addresses a few chemicals in a few products. And that's not enough. The risk of substitution is too high, and we need to deliver a more comprehensive regulation on groups of chemicals to effectively protect human health and for effectively this treaty to deliver environmental and human health protection. And I'm going to stop here and looking forward to continue the conversation.
Thank you very much. That's extremely helpful for setting up the context for really what's at stake here and how challenging it is. Does anybody else want to comment or anybody want to expand on their comments about, in addition to life cycles, if there's any major key barriers at this point? We'll talk about solutions hopefully before we conclude today, but and thank you very much for that suggestion, Daniela, about a specific solution and what's important that we need to keep our eyes on. So any other additional comments from Margaret or Jyoti on some of these challenges that we just heard about? Okay. Margaret, it looks like you're about to speak.
I would just thank you. I would agree with Danielle. I mean, certainly all the things she said are absolutely correct. However, one of the challenges is, of course, the timeline for the resolution called for us to conclude the treaty, the ambition of that by the end of last year, which was probably the fastest process ever. And Jyoti can speak to that, how challenging it is. But that is still, it's an issue that we're contending with right now, and the extension of the meeting is one strategy to deal with that. And I do think that I don't think it's a challenge, but it is a complication, is that there's so many civil society groups, which include all sorts of backgrounds, that and no process that yet has been defined to screen out, information that's science versus non. There's just there's been a lot of confusion by many states, and states come to these meetings with different information. So all of this is quite challenging just from a logistical perspective. And Jyoti, I'll let you handle that part. You're in the middle of it.
Okay, Mario, one more thing, and then we might move to the next question, Mario. But if you want to additional expand on that.
Yeah, just quickly that I totally agree with the previous speakers that plastic pollution is at the crisis level, and it's something that we do need to deal with urgently with a strong treaty. But at the same time, the time spent on things like rules of procedure really seems almost like an attempt to run out the clock by some countries. And I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what it seemed like to me. But we just touched on the civil society participation. I just wanted to mention at the same time that there's also very considerable private sector participation from the plastic treaty industry. And I had actually not been to the negotiation for more than half an hour when I got approached by somebody from that lobbyist from the plastic pollution lobby, or from the plastic production lobby. So that presence also was quite considerable and is likely to influence the negotiations. But yeah, that's all for now.
So let me expand a little bit on civil society. Not everybody on the call will understand. We sort of throw around these terms sometimes a little bit more broadly. So maybe Margaret or Mario or others can expand a little bit on civil society, but also it seems like this treaty is going to be uniquely dependent on non-state actors to actually be parties to the implementation, to be somehow engaged in this. So any thoughts that you can share with the group who might not be as familiar as you all are with the machinations of these treaties about the role of civil society in this treaty, and also the importance of non-state actors in terms of supporting implementation if we cross that finish line.
Sure.
Margaret,
I'll start with this. Civil society is a term that is very broad. In these negotiations, to attend, you have to be accredited. by UNEP, which many of us are. But this includes a very broad group. As when we say a member-led, member-driven process, it means only the members have negotiating authority. Everyone else is somewhat of an advisor. And I give credit to, in particular, it's really important to have civil society involvement. In fact, this topic is of such interest to the public at large, as well as conservation groups and industry and other players, that it's critical that we get this right and that we understand where people are coming from. I think civil society. So I have a slide I can show, which was really about INC 4. Just to give you a sense of the structure of what makes up civil society. So this was INC 4, which was a big, and Jyoti can tell us. Can you see this? Yeah. Can tell us if this was the biggest number of attendees, or if INC 5 surpassed it. You see the blue, dark blue is the member states. The UN, everything in light blue is an observer. So not only are NGOs and industry bucketed in there, there's research institutions, science groups, the UN system itself, which is UNEP, and the international organizations, governmental organizations like WHO, FAO, all observers. And so it's a really broad bucket. However, what we did see was that in the early parts of the negotiations, I was at every meeting starting in Uruguay. These groups, of which Daniela's organization is one, really helped frame up the issues. And, a number of, I think, negotiators came to that meeting thinking it was maybe a clean up plastic treaty instead of dealing with the address, even despite the resolution really said what the scope was. But I think there were folks who were not as clear on what was happening in the latest science, how solutions could be created, and the information provided by, in a very transparent way, I would say the non-governmental organizations was really helpful. I represented the Monterey Bay Aquarium, of course, but also I represented the International Science Council, of which the National Academies is one member, but it's one organization that represents 250 international science unions and associations, national and regional, Royal Societies, national academies, etc. So you can have groups that represent one institution or many, and so we have a mixture of those. The civil society will be able to submit written comments, submit ideas, things like that. So many of the statistics that Daniela reported were actually coming out of reports developed by civil society. So the contribution was immense and continues to be immense. I think the non-transparency is a problem, which you hinted at, Mario, which is that there are other forces at work where, since the member states have all the rights, it's essential that we work with the member states, but they're busy. However, industry is doing the same. So knowing where member states are getting their information is somewhat challenging. And we started to see, in particular, science be questioned in the last meeting, which hadn't really occurred before, because of this contention that is between the like-minded and the ambitious groups. Many of those groups, some governments have tremendous assets of science and information, or even have their own legislation that they've pushed through, and so that has driven their ambition. Others of those are the recipient in the global south of so much of this plastic waste and the chemicals in it, that they are very ambitious to get this fixed. So we have the countries themselves at this point, at the fifth meeting, knew a lot more than they did at the first meeting. And it wasn't only because of their own country information, but the civil society kept bringing that information into the process. The one thing I'll say about science that we've been pushing for is a clear pathway for including independent science and well-vetted science into decision making. And so right now we have no mechanism yet, except for talking directly to member states or providing information. And so the International Science Council, along with many other of these groups, has submitted information in the portal. We've handed it to people. Everyone's been doing that. And you can see, if I were a member state, I'd be overwhelmed with all the information. And yet the groups are trying to be super helpful to give everyone the information that they need. And the challenge is for the member states to sort through it. I used to do legislation, as Tony indicated, and that is a process. It's a messy process. You take everybody's input, and then you try and figure out what it means for how you can negotiate something. And that's where the member states are now, which is why it's very, very hard to get it done in 2 years, just because there's just so much to think about. One of the things that we at the National Academy's report said was very clearly is that you have to deal with all the sectors. It's going to be a sectoral approach, and it's going to be a science-based structure. It has to be, but there's a lot of questioning of how much information we have, which is unfortunate because we know enough to do exactly what Daniela has said. One thing I did want to say that there is going to be an implementation phase, and before that starts, so there's been some confusion in the text as to whether there's a treaty. There's not a treaty. There's language. Nothing's been adopted. I feel like the structure that the chair's text has, it has everything we might need, maybe not everything, but that's where the countries will come in and add and put and take. So it's a really open, still an open field. But after we get the text agreed to, there's going to be a process before the opening for signature, which there'll have to be some engagement in. I predict that there will not be a lot of specifics in the treaty on science-based targets or criteria. I'm hopeful that there'll be criteria, but what you can see is there's some opportunity for additional input after that to tee up information, because the Conference of the Parties, which is the predecessor to implementation, is going to be the place where decisions will be made. And we don't know how long it'll be for that, but there's going to have to be a lot of more. This doesn't stop. When the text goes in, it's only the beginning, is my point. And an implementation phase, it's going to be critical to have ongoing advice from the groups that have been attending so far. What I want to highlight is that at INC4, we had subnationals show up for the first time in force, which means states like California, groups like the Mississippi Rivers and Towns Initiative. Just like in climate, you're going to have people who are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis saying, please help us. We cannot fix this problem on our own. And that is those are critical voices that I'd like to hear more from, because they really are in the front lines, and it's government to government opportunities, just as there was in climate. So we'll see how that goes. But scientific understanding is evolving quickly. There's a dizzying amount of information coming at you on microplastics, health impacts. I was on the Manduru-Monaco Commission on Plastics and Human Health, which is one of the other civil society inputs that really basically says exactly what Daniela said, is that we can't do it without a life cycle approach. There's health issues, there's vulnerable populations. We have to take that into account. And that's an overlay, and also becoming one of the central areas of discussion, but there's no resolution to that yet. I think it's paramount that this protect not only human health, environmental health, but human health. So I'll stop there, but that's kind of the picture.
Thank you, Margaret. Both really clarifying the importance and the breadth of the role of NGOs, but also opening a lot of doors to keeping our eyes on critical issues that I think we'll follow up on a little bit. But I wanted to give Daniela or Mario, and I did need to acknowledge and thank Jody for joining us. She did actually need to hop off to another call, but very generous in her time to be able to tee off this conversation. So let's help her be successful. I think that's maybe our charge for this a webinar. So Daniela or Mario, does anybody else want to expand on what Margaret said? Daniela, why don't we give you the first shot?
Yeah, and maybe I would like to weigh in a bit more into your question of whether there's some what are some of the key barriers for adoption and how
Right.
can be
Thank you.
addressed to build consensus, building on what Mario already talked a bit about the rules of procedure and the possibility of voting. And in fact, with the geopolitical landscape that we have right now in the negotiations, we would say that consensus is in itself a barrier to the adoption of an effective plastics treaty. What we are seeing consistently over the 5 rounds of negotiations that we have had until today is a small group of countries, a minority of countries, particularly petrostates, as Marjo said, that have an interest in sustaining plastics because plastics are the plan B for the fossil fuel industry. We know that plastics and other petrochemicals will sustain 50% of oil demand growth by 2050. And today they represent 16% of oil demand globally. So plastics are the lifeline of the fossil fuel industry. And we are seeing this small group of countries, this minority of petrostates, weaponizing consensus to exert veto power over the majority of countries, which means that they are engaging in bad faith in these negotiations. And they are vetoing the measures that they don't want to see in the treaty. In these diplomatic spaces, when we talk about bad faith and good faith engagement in the negotiations, when we see countries engaging in good faith, that means that countries are trying to build bridges in a negotiation process, so the text eventually reflects what's the best outcome possible that reflects the interest of both parties. But what we are seeing here is a blockage, a veto on the measures that they just don't want to see in the treaty, and not a conversation and a negotiation in good faith with the ambitious countries. And the way to overcome this barrier is to actually remove that veto power from the negotiations. And this, as Marjo would say, can be done by using the INC's rules of procedure to allow for majority-based decision-making, meaning to allow for voting on substantive issues. What we have today is some rules of procedure that are not officially adopted yet, that are not finalized. And although rules of procedure as they stand today would allow for voting or could be used for voting on substantive issues, unless that question of rules of procedure and unless rules of procedure are adopted, it would be really hard for these countries to stop exerting their veto power. And voting is, in fact, the best incentive for them to start engaging in good faith in the negotiations, even if voting is not actually used in the process. Just the possibility for it to exist create an interesting incentive for them to engage in good faith in the negotiations. And I want to build a bit more also on what Margaret was telling about industry interference. And Mario, you were also mentioning that about industry interference in the negotiations, which is also an important barrier for the adoption of an effective plastics treaty. Let's remind that we don't want any plastic treaty. We want a treaty that actually do the job of ending plastic pollution. And there's a conflict of interest with what the treaty needs to do to effectively achieve that outcome of ending plastic pollution and to protect human health and the environment, and what we are seeing around corporate interests in the negotiations. At CL, we have spent a few time over the past INCs analyzing the presence of lobbyists from the fossil fuel industries in the negotiations. In Busan, we found 220 lobbyists from the fossil fuel industries and chemical industries participating in the negotiations, which is an exponential growth from the presence of lobbyists in previous rounds of negotiations. So there's an interest increasing in what the treaty can deliver or how a treaty can be a barrier for their corporate interest. And these 220 lobbyists that we saw at INC5, you might think, oh, that's not too much. We're still a phase that it's little compared to, for example, UNFCCC. But to get you a sense of the magnitude of this number surpasses all European Union delegations, the delegations from all the 27 countries from the European Union, and they also surpass the number of members of the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty and the representatives from the indigenous peoples and frontline communities groups in these negotiations. And the tactics that we are seeing in the negotiations are putting forward false narratives or solutions, or even in some cases harassment to some of scientists engaging in the process. And I will close this intervention around which barriers are we seeing for the adoption of an effective plastics treaty. With one last barrier, and is the economic rationale that, for example, we cannot limit plastic production because that will affect economic development. And in fact, we have data and economic and financial experts like the International Energy and the Institute for Energy and Economic Financial Analysis, AIFA, and Jayati Ghosh, for example, one of the most renowned development economists of our time, advising the contrary and indicating that production limits are actually a tool that it's needed for development, as markets are already seeing a very concerning stage of overcapacity, meaning we have more capacity to produce plastics and we are building and building and building production facilities, but demand is not growing at the same pace. So what that brings onto the economic perspective is that profits are being affected and are being limited. We're seeing prices falling down and profit margins being reduced. We're seeing job losses and facility closures in some regions of the world. And we are seeing a compromise of the financial viability of some industries. We're seeing credit rating agencies downgrading their qualification of some of the biggest plastic producing industries. So in fact, what these economic and financial experts are advising is, in order to maintain industry competitiveness, to protect GDP, leaving plastic production unregulated and unlimited is actually not a good option. So that's another barrier that we need to overcome, and that we need to incorporate some of the states of the market and some of the most updated economic data to progress some of the barriers on the key measures that the treaty needs to have.
So thank you. Big potential challenges, but I think important context. Definitely putting the civil back in civil society seems to be something. Thinking not only of science in the nature of the natural sciences and the impacts, but also thinking about the socioeconomics and bringing that transparency and information about that, so the choices are real choices and not false choices, is sort of what I'm hearing you say. So I appreciate those thoughts. So now I kind of want to make a little transition a little bit to say, most of the coverage about the plastics has been around the impacts on marine environments in the ocean. But Margaret had opened the door a little bit. I'd be interested in folks' thoughts about the other the other impacts of plastics, the human health impacts, the environmental justice impacts, the other issues, and the other, what I would call really drivers of why we need to take action on this right now, in addition to the pollution issue. So I wonder if somebody help sort of expand that a little bit, what their thoughts are about what the other demands are for action now, and what we need to address those broader issues as well. So Mario, we haven't heard from you for a while, so I hope you don't mind me putting you on the spot. If you have any thoughts about why it's important to move forward on this treaty, this agreement, which will become a treaty, hopefully.
Sure. I'm actually going to not talk so much about the human health. I'll leave that to somebody else, although obviously impacts on human health from plastics and are tremendous. But what I would like to talk about is really some of the other equity issues around plastic pollution. And this is something that I hear from my colleagues who live in small island developing states, for example, that cleaning marine litter and plastics from beaches is extremely costly for low-income countries, for small island developing states. And actually had a colleague calculate some figures on that from the work they did in the Seychelles on Aldabra Atoll, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And they conducted a beach cleanup on this very remote atoll and removed 25 tons of marine litter. The total cost to them was $224,000, a little bit over that, so about $8,900 for each ton of litter. And that was just a fraction of what actually was there at that time. So you can see it's very costly. And that litter has harmful impacts on marine life, as we know, but also on human health. So a lot of countries that are at the downstream of this tide of unwanted plastic waste that arrives on their beaches are really suffering from that. It impacts the fisheries sector. Something along the loss of 9.2% of revenue was calculated in Antigua and Barbuda for the fisheries sector. And it also impacts, obviously, the tourism sector, and their operations were had an estimated cost of somewhere between 88 to 258% of the budget of their waste management in that same country of Antigua and Barbuda. So it's really sort of a tremendous cost that a lot of countries are carrying, and it's really unfair to put the burden of that transboundary trash that originates somewhere else most of the time, and which then these countries will have to deal with. So there was an IUCN report that concluded that plastic pollution has serious economic impacts on reducing national GDP by an estimated global average of 7 billion. This was a 2017 calculation, so I'm assuming that figure is now much larger as we have more plastic waste going in. So this is something as one of the reasons why I think equity considerations are so important in this treaty. And in fact, there was a new coalition formed in the INC negotiations called the Coalition of Downstream Underdeveloped Countries, who are negotiating to have the financial resources to be able to deal with this. And as many countries, particularly small islands, are also lacking the recycling facilities to deal with that plastic. I mean, how do can you actually put those in? So there's a lot of finance that is required to address these equity concerns as well. So I'll leave it there and I'll let somebody else talk to the human health impacts.
Margaret, maybe you can, I think you would open that door. So if you dive a little bit more deeply into that, that would be appreciated.
Sure. I think in the National Academy's report, we were not scoped to look at human health. So that was not what Congress asked us for. However, being involved as a member of the Mindro-Monaco Commission on Plastics and Human Health, which was a group of medical professionals, epidemiologists, economists, etc., was a big synthesis of this question: what is the problem with plastics and human health? Well, the equity piece, as Mario mentioned, is something we focused on, which because most of the exposure to the harms of plastic does fall upon people with no protections and at work, that they are touching and managing waste, whether they're waste pickers or not, or they don't really have choices. Many things, and certain groups like women, children, reproductive age people are very much at risk. And so what we did in that report was finally looked at the whole life cycle of plastic, from extraction all the way to disposal. In each part of this cycle, we looked at the exposure pathways and the information known to date about chemicals in the plastic, and also the impacts of the polymers themselves. So the plastic problem is not just one thing. First of all, many types of plastic. We don't really know how much of any particular chemical is added to a plastic, whether it's a plasticizer or a flame retardant or some other. But as our report said, I think 11,000 chemicals. It's really up to 16,000. We've had series of reports saying that there's a lot of chemicals that we're not paying attention to that are in everything we touch. There's so much that we touch. There are things in food, and then so that's the chemicals. Then you have the microplastics, which cause harm. And so you'll see that it causes harm in different groups differentially. But in some very high instances of body burden of chemicals, this is an issue where people really are concerned. I did see this issue rise up very quickly in the negotiations as being a really strong concern, which was great. But that is also a challenge because the information is rapidly changing. However, I have confidence that this is a major challenge for human health and societal health. And one of the things we were able to do in that, and there have been subsequent reports after that, is to try and estimate in a rough way, based on exposure data, body burden data in the United States, and our understanding of the social cost of carbon, all those pieces, billions of dollars of costs are being borne by just from health impacts alone. And those numbers are going to continue to grow. So if you don't You can't just clean your way out of this, as has been said. You have to look at designing plastic with the end in mind. Also look at eliminating unnecessary or problematic plastics, which is an area that some industry has been willing to engage in, those participating in the Ellen MacArthur dialogues, for example. But what this added concern about chemicals, which we don't have enough information on because it's proprietary, and very little information is available to experts on the outside to really say, I know what's in this, I know what's in that. So there's a real emphasis on transparency at the treaty, because you need to know what's in these products. We need to know how much is being made, and also, excuse me, and what the impacts will be of a cumulative burden. And what you're seeing now are all these studies saying there's microplastics in the brain, there's microplastics in the heart, lungs, fetal tissue, everywhere it is. But now we have to think about, so we have a concern right now that there are some in the discussions who say, well, you don't have enough information, so I don't believe it. I think it was very clear, and there will continue to be clear, whether in the courts or in public opinion, or with more and more reports from expert groups, including the World Health Organization, which took up a resolution on this issue and is very concerned. So there's a lot of momentum to look at this, and it is something that is probably going to be enshrined in the final text, that the objective is to protect human health and the environment. Great. How? Developing criteria. How do you decide what is okay and what isn't okay? Once you get the transparency, then you have to decide what should be in. And there are proposals to list chemicals that should not be in plastic, but you also have to reduce the amount of plastic. So there are all these very complicated pieces, and all that information is in the hands of the people who create the products. There's a lot of opportunity for change just by eliminating plastics, particularly single-use plastics, and these small island developing states to the large ocean states are definitely very concerned about this. And anyone who's in a place that doesn't have the ability to manage the waste that's coming in is looking for solutions that involve reuse, return, not making more stuff as substitutes. And so I just want to say that the volume is a health issue, the ingredients are a health issue, and the ubiquity is a health issue. And all of those things have to be dealt with in this treaty in some way.
Great. Thank you, Margaret. Danielle, do you want to add anything else to those comments about the sort of some of these secondary or really critical issues that maybe aren't front and center in the public dialogue anyway?
Yes, definitely. And we are all seeing the news out there, right? Yesterday, The Guardian released an article about the ubiquity of microplastics. They're everywhere, in our brains, and even in the places that we thought were safe, like mother placentas. Chemicals and microplastics are everywhere, and we need to address this, and human health needs to be a transversal issue of the Plastics Treaty. At CL, we have had a focus on plastics and human health and on chemicals of concern, and we are certain that we need a strong approach on human health in this treaty. And to complement what Margaret just said, I think that there are maybe two elements that I want to elaborate here in order to ensure the treaty effectively protects human health and also addresses environmental justice concerns. We know that Indigenous peoples and frontline communities that live close to the plastic production facilities are suffering from the disproportionate impacts of plastic pollution. Well, it can be because of the chemicals that are leaching and are being emitted on those factories, and of a build-out that it's continuous and that is affecting these communities. We know the Cancer Alley in the US, for example, and the consequences that is having on the human health of frontline communities, but also how the extraction of fossil fuels is harming Indigenous peoples' territories and the increasing connection between plastics and the extraction of fossil fuels as well. So to deliver these things, I would say, Margaret, you just said that volume is an issue. The more plastics we produce, the more we will be exposed to microplastics and to the chemicals that are in plastics. Let's not forget that plastic is a chemical itself. So the more plastics we produce, the more exposure we will have. So ensuring that this treaty effectively delivers a dedicated article with legally binding provisions to limit plastic production is essential. And as we said, this is a full life cycle approach. So we need supply side measures, but demand side measures as well. And we need them both, because demand side measures alone will not be sufficient. We have models telling us that we can ban some specific products, which is the trend that we are seeing today in more than 60 countries around the world. But that doesn't mean that production is going to curb, because plastic is finding an infinite amount of applications to allocate itself in. And one example that I usually put to negotiators is the increasing market of artificial flowers and plants. It's a market that is growing 4% per year. So plastic will always find different applications to allocate itself. So we need, yes, to ban some of the most problematic products, but that won't be enough to reduce the size of the problem that we have today. We need to couple that with supply side measures that address directly the production of plastics to reduce the size of that problem. Continuing to justify the expansion of plastic production is continuing to justify the expansion of plastic production facilities and the harm this is doing to frontline communities and to indigenous peoples' territories. So the first measure that the treaty should incorporate is a stop in the construction of new plastic production facilities. What we have today on the table to reduce the size of the problem is a promise to deal with this at a later stage, at the conference of the parties. But we need countries to take immediate action to curb the growth of plastic production, and that can start by stopping the construction of new production facilities if we also want to address some of the environmental justice concerns related with plastic pollution. Second, we need a treaty to ban chemicals of concern comprehensively. As I was mentioning in my previous intervention, some of the recent studies have identified more than 4,000 chemicals that are toxic for the environment and for human health. And we cannot just ban one chemical in one product, let's say bisphenol A in toys, because the risk of substitution is too high. We have bisphenol S, for example, that has similar health impacts and toxicity concerns. We need a comprehensive ban of the chemicals of concern used in all plastic products. There is no level of exposition to harms and to toxicity that should be acceptable. And third, as many of the decisions will be postponed to the conference of the parties, for example, around reducing the size of the problem dealing with plastic production, we have a promise for the conference of the parties to deal with that at a later stage right now. We need to make sure that the conference of the parties is not paralyzed by obstructionism. And this keeps us back to the discussion that we were having about consensus. What we are seeing in other multilateral environmental agreements is a conference of the parties that has quite limited power to take decisions because countries are exerting veto power. So we need to make sure that the COP is able to take majority-based decisions to deliver those promises that the text is giving us right now. As Margaret says, this is only the beginning. And we need to make sure that the conference of the parties can work and can deliver us the implementation measures that we need for this treaty. And last but not least, money is a key issue if we want to address those global inequalities that Mario, you were mentioning as well. So we need money to implement the transformations, and we need to overcome the tensions between donor and recipient countries that are spilling over. We saw tensions at the CBD COP last year. We saw these tensions at the UNFCCC, and those are spilling over into the plastics treaty negotiations. We need to resolve those tensions so we have an equity approach to the implementation of this instrument. And just food for thought, applying the polluter pays principle with regards of who is going to pay for the implementation of the treaty could help ease those tensions. One of the, peculiar things about this process is that we don't have that dichotomy between developed and developing countries translating into donor and recipient countries. Because now here, the spectrum of producing countries is both developed and what we would say developing. We had Gulf countries being one of the biggest countries where expansion of plastic production is occurring. We have players like China. So that dichotomy is not very clear. And maybe if we apply the polluter pays principle into the discussions about who is going to pay for the instrument and how can we generate an arrangement that helps us to overcome those classic tensions between donor and recipient countries, is something that can help us overcome and ensure that there is money for it and that the promises that we have right now are effectively deliverable.
Great. I appreciate that. And we really need to shift to questions here to be sure we get some of the engagement from the audience to questions. I will say I'm going to alert the panelists that I'm going to come back to them before we conclude and say, what do you think that, Daniela, you're going to have a hard time picking one. What's the one most important thing you think they need to do to be a successful treaty? So give some thought to that, because I'll give you all the last word. But Katie, hopefully you've been monitoring the chat, and also I saw at least one hand raised. So maybe if I could ask you to just put a couple of questions and ask people to keep their answers brief, because we do need to make sure we can get as many questions as we can during this. So Katie, did you see any questions you can tee up for us, please?
Sure. I think one question that was initially directed towards Margaret was regarding the voice of Indigenous peoples and how that can be incorporated into negotiations, particularly as a part of civil society, or if there are measures to consider Indigenous considerations and knowledge in addition to science-based measures.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that, but I know Daniela has mentioned it already. So right now, while Indigenous groups are represented at the treaty, they're not treated as a government. And so that is a challenge there. There may be some opportunities ahead. I think they are recognized in a different way under the UN system, but right now they're a voice of civil society. We have seen not only in the resolution, but also in the discussions, emphasis on including Indigenous voices as well as in consideration of how to protect human health and the environment. But I don't think they're fully represented at all. I do think that their message is heartbreaking and difficult because we know that the system is not set up to deal with their issue, which is loss of land, loss of income, loss of dignity. So many levels. There are aspects of this that are treating plastic waste and pollution as a human rights issue. That's been raised by the High Commissioner. And so we have an opportunity to utilize Indigenous knowledge, but also to recognize sovereignty of many of these groups, and that so far has not been done. So I can turn the rest over to Daniela, but in general, their point of view is, don't harm the earth and don't harm its people. And we are doing both right now. And so their voices are very important to hear.
Did you want to add something quickly, Daniela, before we move on to the other questions?
Yes, and I know that I don't want to put you on the spot, Lynn, but I know that Lynn Jacobs is in the call, which he's a member of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Plastics. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but I also don't want to speak on behalf of Indigenous peoples. So maybe I will give my minute to Lynn in case she wants to speak up a bit for 1 minute on what are the remarks that Indigenous peoples have for this.
Thank you. Please, if you're able to unmute and share a thought, that would be appreciated.
Yes, thank you, Daniela. I wasn't planning to, but thank you very much. I think what I just had wanted to point out on the slide that Margaret had shared, and thank you for the extra information and context you also provided just now. Just to note that Indigenous peoples were not present at all on the slide, and Indigenous peoples have been participating since the beginning of this process and growing in numbers and in strength and in our organization. And we are pushing very hard to ensure that the treaty recognizes and upholds the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. At present, this is not in the text. It was at certain points, and at the very last text that we have. It is not. And so generally in the treaty, there are calls to use Indigenous knowledge, to incorporate Indigenous knowledge, but the text does not at the same time ensure the protections of that knowledge and the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples throughout the entire process, because we can't be, using our knowledge in ways that are inappropriate and lack protections. And so I guess just to conclude, I hope that people present here and who might be present at INC 5.2 might encourage, member states that you're speaking with to ensure that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and rights in general of Indigenous peoples and human rights are very strongly incorporated throughout the treaty text. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn, very much. And thank you, Daniela, for recognizing that and allowing that voice to participate. Mario, you have a quick comment?
It's a very quick follow-up in that the BBNJ agreement actually does all of those things, which is one example of how this could be done in an international treaty. It does recognize the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, right? In the preamble, it talks about rights of Indigenous peoples and use of knowledge, but also protections for that knowledge. So I'm just putting that out there as perhaps an example to look at. I mean, it's not perfect, but I think it's a big step forward.
Thank you, Mario, for that. Other questions, Katie?
We have a few questions that I think our panelists have already addressed in their replies. There is one question we could perhaps elaborate a bit further regarding engagement with industry. And while there are no specific provisions that have been agreed upon yet, if there's been any positive engagement with lobbyists or industry to try and work towards methods to help limit plastic impacts, particularly with shipping industry companies. If perhaps any of our panelists could share a bit more insight there.
I guess I'll just say, shipping, that's a very specific question. The plastic pollution issue implicates many other multilateral agreements, whether it's the MARPOL or and the Basel Convention, for example. And there are already requirements on shipping of plastic waste in the Basel Convention, of which the United States is not a party, but has signed. Anyway, and so there's a lot of discussion around that. But I would say, stepping back a little, when we say industry, that's a very broad term. There is a group called the Business Coalition for a Global Plastic Treaty that are more in the sort of center of the supply chain, who are trying to figure out how to manage the situation. So they've been more willing to go to production as a reduction as something they need to do, which would be different from the oil and gas and plastic industries, which are not wanting to do that at all, or even be transparent, which is incredibly unfortunate, because how can you deal with this problem without having data or information that will be critical to identifying the worst things to get out of our systems. The other thing is that there are a lot of voluntary discussions, and any country is able, I think what we've been seeing occurring is that member states are starting to group together different coalitions, and potentially there's an opportunity for a group of member states to make an agreement or do something like that. That's a very specific idea, but and as this process slows or maybe breaks, we'll see what happens. There will be more opportunity for creativity, but I'm not sure that I'm not aware. It hasn't come up in the discussions, and I haven't seen anything announced. But in the upcoming UN Ocean Conference, with plastic pollution is a topic of interest. You'll see voluntary commitments show up, and I'll be curious to see what other ways there are to improve this. And I'm not an expert on the Basel Convention, but that's one area I think shipping is absolutely implicated in being part of a solution.
Katie, I think we have time for maybe one more question. So we do need to respect everybody's time and conclude on time. But if there's another question that you,
We do have one last question in the chat on how the new instrument can effectively support financing for implementation, including the private sector.
that might be a separate webinar in and of itself. But if anybody has a very quick thing mentioned on the financing, particularly enabling private sector and other frameworks, any mechanisms specifically in the treaty. Mario, did you raise your hand?
I did, but I think Daniela did as well. Do you want to go
Thank you.
first, Daniela?
Go.
Go, Mario, please.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be really brief. Well, will be a financial mechanism established for this treaty. I mean, that's a given for all treaties. But let me just mention the private sector involvement. And I think it's been talked about a little bit already. It's sort of a combination of sticks and carrots. I mean, there's been talk about plastic taxes, fees, environmental levies, those kinds of things that speak to that polluter pays principle. And in fact, I think Ghana has proposed a global plastic pollution fee that would target the producers of primary plastic polymers. So that's one proposal out there. There's extended producer responsibility already mentioned in a text where the producer takes responsibility for the product through its life cycle. But I think what could be also more interesting to discuss is sort of the carrot side and how does one partner with the private sector in a more positive way? And there are some examples of that, mostly from smaller companies, but also some larger ones as well in the voluntary commitments of the UN Ocean conferences. Everything from the tourism minister, for example, reducing single-use plastics to sort of relatively innovative ways to clean it up, to companies that voluntarily want to do extended producer responsibility and sort of innovate on ways that plastic can actually be replaced entirely. So I think there's very much an opportunity for partnership with private sector, but in a positive way that actually drives change from that side. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mario. Daniela?
Yes, maybe just to quickly add some thoughts to that is also when thinking about the carrot and not the stick, we also, I think, need to think how regulation can be a platform for enhancing industry competitiveness. And I think that we need to move beyond this paradigm of thinking that regulation is against competitiveness and could be a barrier for competitiveness when we have data indicating that in this case, regulation can be a friend of that competitiveness. So bringing companies into an engagement with how that regulation can help support competitiveness, alternative markets, trade opportunities is also that can be interesting in this conversation. And also to finalize, yes, the treaty will have a financing mechanism, of course, and how that financing mechanism is going to work probably is going to take us more time than the one that we have right now. Right now, the discussion is on other things, on how that financing mechanism is going to be structured. And one of the main conversation is, are we going to have a dedicated fund for this treaty, or are we going to use some of the funds that already exist, like the JEF, for example? And overcoming that dichotomy is going to be absolutely important, and also overcoming some of the barriers that we have seen from existing funds like the JEF, for example, in terms of accessibility. It's going to be absolutely essential to allow for transitions to happen at the speed that we need to happen, and also with accessibility issues and like all of the requirements that we need of a fund that effectively allows for the treaty to be implemented.
Great. Thank you very much. So before we conclude, I'm going to give everybody one last shot. So we're going to ask our panelists to say, what is the one most significant thing you'd like to see this in this treaty that would make it successful? We'll start with Margaret. It's hard.
And you violated my rule because there is no silver bullet. However, because it is an all of society problem. Yeah. However, we need a framework that includes the entire life cycle and a mechanism for bringing in science to improve and strengthen the treaty over time. We cannot leave any part of the process out, even if we don't have obligations at the first. This is start and strengthen. You need this solid framework, or else we can't make this work.
Thank you. Mario?
Thanks. I'm actually going to very much echo what Margaret said, that to have a strong treaty really needs to address the full life cycle of plastics. It should have binding rules and obligations. It should be well financed, and it should be supported by science.
Daniela?
And you were right, I cannot choose a silver bullet
I
either.
know.
Uh, so yeah, I would say we need legally binding, mandatory rules, not voluntary rules. We have already seen what voluntary rules mean in other multilateral environmental agreements and across the full life cycle of plastics. And within that bag, I would say four things. A dedicated article to limit and reduce plastic production. That's absolutely essential. We need to reduce the size of the problem. A comprehensive ban on chemicals of concern if we want to effectively protect human health. We need mandatory money for implementing the treaty, following the polluter pays principle. And we need to allow for the COP to actually overcome obstructionism if we are going to start and strengthen, as Margaret would say. And I would close with a sentence from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which is like popular these days with the 100 Years of Solitude Netflix series. And he says in that book, he talks about a paradise of shared solitude. So let's not end up in a paradise of shared solitude, and let countries find their wisdom in time to deliver a shared, livable future for us all.
Thank you. That's a wonderful way to conclude the formal remarks here. Again, I would just moderator's program. I want to thank everybody on this panel, not only for the panel, but the incredible work they've done over the years to commit to this, and there'll be many work ahead and opportunities moving forward. I certainly have heard three very high level things, which is the essential charge to this group was to address the full life cycle, and so they need to do that. So let's go back to the first principles in the charge and not try to cut the quarters on that. Two, great credit for moving it so quickly, but delay is not the answer, and deferring decisions into the future is really going to help it. It's just going to move it. So any decisions and hard decisions they can make in the short term are critical. So let's keep the pressure on to make those extremely difficult decisions. I do really thinking about not only the full life cycle, but the full impacts. So really thinking about the health impacts and the other impacts, and the justification for this, and recognizing that we need to make people responsible for that, and the only way to do that is to make them accountable in some way. So whether it's mandatory or framework. So I think an accountability regime that's really clear and continues to be able to incorporate the knowledge that's going to be developing over time that Margaret suggested is another critical element. So again, thank you all very, very much. We very much look forward to continuing to track this treaty, to track the work that you're doing and others moving forward. And with that, I will turn it over to Miriam to sort of bring this into a close.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, speakers. We appreciate very much all the insights that you have provided today. Regarding the third webinar, tentatively scheduled for the 4th of March, it will be addressing the topic of sustainable blue economy. It will focus on the advancement of blue economy practices, explore the development of a sustainable and regenerative blue economy, and development of national plans for sustainable ocean economies. Given that by definition, blue economy seeks to promote economic growth, social inclusion, and preservation of or improvement of livelihoods, while at the same time ensuring environmental sustainability. It is an integrative approach to ocean management that both the Roca reports and the Global Ocean Forum in its strategic plan have identified as a priority pathway to conservation and sustainable use of the ocean. The high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy aims to achieve 100% sustainable management of member countries' ocean areas under their national jurisdictions by 2030. National sustainable ocean plans are guided by a comprehensive framework that includes recommendations to transform how to protect and use the ocean over the next decade. Sustainable ocean planning is pivotal in addressing the 10 ocean decade challenges for a collective impact and in advancement of a more prosperous and resilient future for people and the planet, to be supported by an Ocean Decade program on sustainable ocean planning, which is currently under development. As such, this third webinar will seek to provide a platform to discuss the requirements and implications to governments and non-state actors of building a blue economy that utilizes ocean and coastal resources while emphasizing economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental preservation. The third webinar will also follow a panel discussion format with renowned experts focusing on key questions that include how to galvanize private financial research and civil society sectors to help accelerate development and implementation of sustainable ocean plans, including perhaps initiatives that address the plastics issue. Please watch out for the save the date announcement about this webinar forthcoming very soon. Thanks very much again for coming to today's webinar. Hope to see you in March.
Thank you very much. And Katie, a special thanks to Katie Mitchell, who really makes these things run and organizes them. So thank you very much, Katie. Thanks again to everybody. Perhaps if we see you if you'll be at the UN Ocean Conference in Nice, maybe we'll introduce each other and be able to meet each other in person and maybe hopefully advance some of these aspects there as well. So again, thank you very much. All the best and look forward to continuing the work.